And 30andnerdy.com is live!
Woohoo!
Woo! So for 30andnerdy.com, I am Matt Sternad, Twitter handle at 30andnerdy, and 30 is spelled out. And across from me is...
I'm Scott William Hannon, Twitter handle at SWHannon, Hannan. There's no further address for that, is there?
I don't think so.
So you should say like at web address or .com or something.
And we have a very special conversation tonight. I think it's special.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited for it. The topic at hand will be Japanese role-playing games, or JRPGs for short. And in specific, we want to ask the question, what makes a good JRPG? It's a very popular genre, tons of entries, and a wide variety of games, and a very central core to the gaming culture, specifically in the past 20 years or so. Yeah. So, Matt, do you want to walk us through precisely, at least, what is a JRPG for starters?
A JRPG? Well, traditionally, so we can start by saying that there's a wide variety of Japanese role-playing games. I think that when people see the acronym JRPG, they're mostly thinking of turn-based combat, sprawling adventures, titles such as Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy come to mind, and I don't know. How would you define it?
Well, it's all in the abbreviation. It's a Japanese role-playing game.
Okay.
In specific, we're talking about the video game.
Yeah, true.
The Japanese role-playing game, and like you said, traditionally we're talking about turn-based strategy in terms of combat. Typically, top-down view of the world, going into a side view during combat. It changed up a little bit. In some elements, I know a couple of the Dragon Quest games did a third-person perspective as you walked around the world, and then went to a side view, or even just like a slightly above-the-shoulder view for combat.
Or first-person sometimes also.
Or first-person sometimes also. Phantasy Star, one of the original JRPGs, was revolutionary in giving you the first-person perspective as you traversed through a dungeon. So that was a really long time ago, at a time when it still counted as 3D, but it was just very tricky two-dimension. So that's just a foundational definition for JRPG. And of course, we'll get into the mechanics a little bit, but the reason we're onto this subject is because you, Matt, you went to a Pokemon tournament last week.
Yes.
And, and it sparked my interest in the topic, and I'm certain that your interest is pretty consistent. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Pokemon tournament without spoiling your intentions for the documentary, because you shot up all out footage there, apparently.
We took a lot of footage. We've got a little bit of B-roll to film still, but the heart of it is all film. So yeah, I went to the Pokemon Nationals in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was the weekend of July 4th, so whichever days surround that weekend. And, oh man, I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised all around with the experience. I guess you were asking me firsthand, one of the things that you were most curious about was exactly how a Pokemon tournament works.
Yes.
Because Pokemon, I don't know if a lot of people know. A lot of people that don't know anything about Pokemon know that it is actually just a JRPG. That's what it is. And so the cool thing about it is that it's essentially still turn-based combat, player against player. Because like in the Pokemon universe, you are a Pokemon trainer, and you have your Pokemon in your Pokeballs, and you throw them into battle, and they come out of the Pokeballs, and like they battle each other. And so essentially, you're entering battle commands for them, no different than you would in, say, a Final Fantasy game. Everything from water, fire, electric attacks, physical attacks, and stuff like that. And so the way that I like to describe it is it's kind of like, it's almost like chess meets paper, rock, scissors. Because in anything fantasy role-playing based, you've got elemental spells and things like that, and certain things are super effective or resistant to each other and stuff like that. That's where I get the paper, rock, scissors. Is there's resistances, there's bonus damage, but at the heart of it all, you're taking turns in role-playing fashion. So essentially, what the tournament is, depending on the day that you're there, is it's a round of battles, either how do I describe this? You're literally sitting across from a table from somebody else, and you each have your 3DS systems with the screen flipped up so you can't see each other's screens, and they connect to each other, and the battle plays out on your screens. It's kind of like my Pokemon. I see them from my perspective, and they see me from their perspective, and depending on your Pokemon's speed and things like that, somebody's going to go first. So the interesting thing, and how legit, and I guess you could say hardcore of an experience going to one of these tournaments is so you're paired up in a computer system, and the first few rounds are random because they don't know who's good at the game and who's bad at the game. And as you win more battles, your name goes back into the computer as a winner, and you start, battling more winners and stuff like that. So I'm sitting there across from somebody else, and one of the referees comes by, and they give you a slip of paper. And on that slip of paper is your player ID and your name. And so we battle it out. One of us wins, one of us loses. We each have a pool of 6 Pokemon that we chose to bring into battle and that we customize, but we can only choose 4 of these Pokemon to battle. And so it's about sizing up your opponent's team, seeing what you have and what they have, trying to predict what they're going to send out first and second and how you're going to counter that, or maybe try to just like overpower it. Anyways, at the end of all of these rounds of duking it out and whatnot, you raise your hand, and the referee comes by. The referee gives you a pen. And the first thing the referee says is, "Who won?" And you say, "So-and-so won." We both, on that piece of paper, initial, next to our names, that we're agreeing that this is who won and this is who lost, circling win or lose. The referee also signs their name on it. The barcode next to your number gets highlighted, and then those slips are what get brought to the computer system to get scanned to give the computer the information on where you're possibly going to go in your next round of battles. So
It's a little intense.
Yeah, and before you even get to any of that stuff, when you register, oh darn it, we cut out. Can you see me?
I can see hear you fine. You're good.
Oh, that was weird. It like flashed the screen. I wonder if my signal was hiccuping for a while. And so that's when you're actually battling. Like pre-battling, another set of referees actually checks your game card. I assume they scan it over Wi-Fi somehow to make sure that you're not using like hacked Pokemon and stuff like that. Scott, I could go on and on about it.
Okay.
But I guess the point being that at its heart is it's player versus player Japanese role-playing turn-based combat.
Okay, so this is just a quick question of the rule set here, or preparation. So you get 6 Pokemon that you've collected from the game, and then per battle you get to choose only 4 of those? Is that the idea?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
and so,
that's for official tournament play. Yeah.
Okay. And so those 6 you have to have collected from the game by playing it. So some people could have a completely different 6, not just because they've chosen a different 6, but because they've completed a certain amount of the game.
Well,
or does everyone have
guess.
like the same pool?
Well, for example, like in every generation of Pokemon that comes out, there's always at least 2 versions of it. And so for in this most recent generation, yes, there's going to be Pokemon in Y and Pokemon in X. Some slight differences. Overall, you share the same pool, and there's instructions and rule sets that are set out and available online in PDF format before you even begin, letting you know what kinds of items are and aren't you may or may not be able to use, what Pokemon are and are not legal. It has to do with the region in the game and where you're collecting them and stuff like that. So if you're into competitive play at this level, I guess you know what you have to work with and what resources are at your fingertips to acquire good Pokemon, well before a tournament begins.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Sweet.
The documentary goes super deep into all this stuff.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid giving away too much from what you want to put together for later. So then let's get into a quick history of JRPGs. Wikipedia was a little sketchy this time for our history lesson, and I couldn't find too much that was just a simple breakdown of the history. But if you want to walk us through from what you can remember on your own, mixed with what was reliable from Wikipedia, please take us through.
Yeah, sure.
The history of JRPGs.
I've got it here. Because if you Wikipedia JRPG history, as we found out, you're going to get the history of pen and paper JRPGs, which is going to date back to primarily the mid-'80s. So if you Wikipedia the history, me see what it's called. The History of Eastern Role-Playing Video Games. And you're also going to see mainly PC titles, like for the NEC PC-8801 titles. Well, that's Load Runner on there. Let me see what kind of, like a particularly important Japanese role-playing game was Bokosuka Wars, originally released for the Sharp X1 computer in 1983 and later ported to the NES in 1985. So you see a lot of this developed for PC, ported to NES, because of course it looks like for example, that Bokosuka Wars, I don't even know what that is. I guess it's just a JRPG. 1983, that would have been right around the time of the kind of like the crash of arcades and Atari out here.
Good point.
And then if it was ported to NES in 85, I wonder if 85 was still during the crash here, but in Japan, the NES landscape would have been very, very different.
Yeah.
Hypothetically.
Yeah. I think it was pretty strong here, too. It seems like 85 was sort of like the resurgence or the reconstruction era of video games.
Yeah.
And at least just from my brief research, games like Phantasy Star and Final Fantasy came out in 87, so it seems like between 85 and 87 is when the RPG began to, or the JRPG, began to take foot in the console world.
Yeah, and I'm seeing other titles here, like there's a game called Dragon Slayer. There's also companies that probably aren't around anymore, like Nihon Falcom. There's even the mention of Legend of Zelda in here and whatnot, but yeah, I guess despite the early history of all this, it's safe to say that what popularized JRPGs in the West would be titles like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star.
Sure. All right, well, with that said, then, when did you discover the JRPG?
Sorry, I laugh because I was trying to do a little bit of math earlier today, and the date that comes into mind is 1997. I admittedly found JRPGs a lot later than I would like to admit. I feel like the first JRPG that I played was probably Pokemon Red, and I don't even think that I knew it was a Japanese role-playing game at the time. I just knew it was a really, really fun game for a Game Boy. And so I have these very vivid memories of seeing commercials for Final Fantasy VII on TV, and they were all CG cutscenes of Cloud on his motorbike going through Midgar and stuff like that. But it wouldn't be until, I want to say, somewhere around my freshman or senior year in high school, when I went over to one of the kids that lived around the block. He had a PlayStation, he had Final Fantasy VII, and I played it there, just like a little bit, a very early portion of the game in one of the boss battles. And I remember running home to my friend Josh, who lived across the street, and I was trying to describe to him this amazingly mature game, the likes of which he had never seen or heard before, where there's 3 players on a screen at the same time, and you take turns controlling them, and they cast spells, and the graphics are amazing, and so it's kind of like a tie between Final Fantasy VII and Pokemon, and that's why I joke that I feel like if I had a Super Nintendo as a child instead of a Sega Genesis, and granted, there were games like Phantasy Star and was it Breath of Fire that was on Genesis? No, probably not. There were some Genesis JRPGs. It wasn't Breath of Fire. What's that series that was also on Sega Saturn? Anyways, I had a Genesis, and I never had a Super Nintendo, and so I missed out on the Final Fantasy games and the likes of Chrono Trigger and the Secret of Mana and all those things. And so it wasn't until after I discovered Final Fantasy VII that I was able to really go back and play those 16-bit versions for the first time, years later.
Sure.
How about you?
I think I came to them very late as well. I remember as a kid, at one point, I did have Legend of Zelda for NES, but that doesn't quite count. That's more of an action-adventure game. But it's also kind of a role-playing game. So that was like the earliest exposure I had, but the first serious in-depth exposure I had was similar. It was Final Fantasy VII. Our mutual friend Garrett was playing it, and I didn't understand it. Like it, it didn't make any sense to me. You know, I played a lot of sports games as a kid. I played a lot of action adventure games, and shooters. I had a handful of PC games. Real-time strategy I was big into. So turn-based, walk around, fight random monsters that you can't see until they're fighting you. Like it just didn't make any sense to me. And neither did it make any sense to like dump 100 hours into a game. I remember I had a couple other friends in high school who were really into Final Fantasy VII. They were talking about maxing out the clock.
99,
Final Fantasy VII,
99,
yeah, because it didn't count past an hour and a half or 100 and a half hours or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until actually undergrad, just before I graduated, where a friend of mine had created a Dreamcast emulator disc that had had 900 Nintendo games on it, and I sat down and I played the original Final Fantasy, and adored it. I had so much fun playing that game. Then I played Final Fantasy II, Japan 2, not American 2.
Right.
And then I bought 7 and I bought 9, and I started playing through 9. Adored 9. And then I'm still only hit, like touch and go with JRPGs, but I'm fascinated by the genre. I have a lot of respect and interest in it, but I don't have a strong background.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Real quick here before, not that anybody ever jumps down our throats, but in case somebody's screaming that I said Breath of Fire was on the Genesis, it was not. However, what I was thinking of was Shining Force.
Oh.
Yeah, so I'm on GameFAQs right now, and I pulled up a list that says top 10 greatest RPGs for the Sega Genesis. They have Light Crusader, never heard of it. Landstalker, never heard of it. Shining in the Darkness, never heard of it. Anyway, Shining Force is on there, but besides Shining Force and Phantasy Star 2 and 4, I haven't heard of any of the other 6 to 7 games, It was like SNES off the top of my head. Like I said, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy, American 2 and 3, which was 4 and 6. Yeah, like Super Mario RPG. I'm sure that's Squaresoft.
Earthbound.
Yeah, Earthbound. And there's probably more.
Oh, there are tons of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, my roommate has a whole drawer full of them in the other room. I could probably just start picking through them.
SNES RPGs?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just RPGs, but he has a huge, a very wide collection of Super Nintendo games, and within that collection are several RPGs. In fact, it was a couple years ago we played through Secret of Mana together.
Oh, nice! Yeah, that's fun co-op. I have a multi-tap in a drawer just to do 3 players.
I did that a long time ago when I was a kid, way before I knew really what I was getting into. A friend of mine brought over Secret of Mana, and I happened to have a multi-tap for some reason, and so we played Secret of Mana all afternoon one time. I was like, oh yeah, that was a lot of fun, but I never followed up on it.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, then, what is it that appeals to you about the JRPG genre or the tropes of the JRPG?
I feel like what appeals to me is probably what I feel are the pillars of the genre, and that is sprawling world, just like a very detailed, thought-out world, like the video game equivalent of a novel. Like, I love that these games typically take 50 to 100 hours to just, make it through the storylines and not do side content. I like the characters and just like this ensemble cast of, say, 8-ish characters that you get to kind of like choose your 3 favorites to kind of like customize and bring them back. Depending on the mechanics, every game's a little bit different. So, sprawling story, ensemble cast of characters. I like a world to explore. I believe that JRPGs should have freedom and not just be go to the next place, go to the next place, go to the next place. I feel like that's one of the things that was very lost in this generation of Japanese role-playing games versus like the PlayStation and Super Nintendo days. Was they're a lot more linear now, and not all of them, but especially Final Fantasy and stuff like that. And I love deep menus and customizations and magic systems and being able to equip armor and magic and look at stats, and it's everything that most games aren't.
Well, let's pick that apart a little bit. Because at least at the very end there, when you're saying I like stats and I like menus,
Yes.
that doesn't sound fun. I know exactly what you're talking about. So to begin with, one of the things you pointed out was an ensemble cast, and I think that's something we probably should have mentioned earlier now that I think about it, because that's a huge difference. A lot of other games, let's just start at the beginning, Donkey Kong, it's just Donkey and Mario. Super Mario Brothers, it's Mario, and then Luigi, sort of. And Zelda, it's Link. The game's called Zelda, but you're Link. And you don't really see her for most of the game.
Only 50% of the people know that. Play it.
And even then, it's not... As a kid, I didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't know.
When I first played Link to the Past, it didn't make any sense that was also a pun. I didn't realize Link was also his name, and Link to the Past was supposed to be clever. And even then, Zelda and Link being the main characters, or even Zelda, Link, and Ganon, that's not an ensemble cast. That's just a few characters. One of the big differences, it seems to be, with the JRPG is that you have your main character, but you collect, or you begin with, a group of characters in the same way that you would in a tabletop pen and paper game. You have 5 or 6 of your friends, or your cohorts, or people who get wrapped up in your story that come along with you for various reasons, some legitimate, some are dumb. But you end up with, like you said, an ensemble, and the better games seem to utilize those characters and their differences to help the story that you're playing through progress or become more complicated. And as well, they also have powers or abilities that seem to match their character type.
Mm-hmm.
And using those powers, it's supposed to be an expression of who they are, and it's a strange way for the game to get you to role play a character via the mechanics of a game.
Yeah, I feel like RPGs, especially in the mid to late '90s, Final Fantasy VII and afterwards, and probably for a lot of people on the SNES, it's almost like, how do I word this? I guess what I'm about to say is that television right now is kind of going through this golden era, if you will, with really good production value and really good acting and sprawling stories over multiple seasons and stuff like that, which is beautiful and wonderful. And before TV was this awesome, there were movies, there was crappy TV, and there were video games. And when I was playing stuff like I know. And when I was playing stuff like Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10 back in the day, and all the other RPGs that don't start with the words Final Fantasy, I don't know, a part of me felt like I was ahead of my time in that I wasn't reading a book to experience an epic storyline, and I also wasn't limited to 2 to 2.5 hour film experiences. I had this digital interactive story unfolding in front of me that I partially was and wasn't in control of, and it was amazing, and especially in the PS1, PS2, SNES heyday for the genre, there was something cutting edge about it, in the realm of entertainment.
I think it's apt to compare it to a novel. Video games often get compared to cinema, and it's funny because it's the JRPG that actually bridged the gap, or emphasized or encouraged the comparison to cinema, because a game like the original Final Fantasy up until, let's say, Final Fantasy VII, before there were these elaborate cutscenes, and not that anything after that is less intense or less long, but yeah, it had the length of a novel. With a movie, you're sitting down usually between an hour and a half to 3 hours, and then it's over with. With a role-playing game, you can be playing, not to tuck out of frame, you can be playing for 50 hours, 100 hours, 200 hours. Games like Skyrim and Oblivion, which are Western RPGs we can get to later, you can sink hundreds upon hundreds of hours into, and that's the amount of time you dedicate to a book. Yeah. Not even the longest book takes that many hours to read, but it's more on par with the amount of time you spend with a book, and typically also the scale of the story in terms of length. You know, it's more like War and Peace or something like. I'm trying to think of a good book that takes place over many, many years. It's like the Iliad and the Odyssey don't exactly count, but the point is, they have these vast, sprawling stories with tons of characters, and you can get those in movies, but it feels a little bit different because you spend so much more time with a JRPG or even some of the longer Western RPGs than you do with a movie. Even though you could rewatch the movie and over again, but similarly you could play it over and over again. And yeah, there's something about that length and the complexity of the story and the interaction of the characters that so long as the game isn't just dragging itself out, that it's actually using all of these moments to build to something, to complicate the characters, to not up their motivations, it's very engaging, and it's more of a narrative experience than other games, even now, or even games previously, and much more games previously. As you compare it to something like Mario, like Final Fantasy has a story, Mario has the end of a level. So you want to, you want to spend that time getting to the end of the story. It's, you know, if Super Mario Brothers were, you know, a 200-hour game, like, it'd be exhausting.
That's kind of how I gauge some of my favorites in the genre also is, did I beat the game, did I complete it, and did I play it more than once? There's plenty of great JRPGs out there that I actually never finished for one reason or another, but generally, if I'm hooked to the very end of a 50-hour experience, it's because the story was stellar. I mean, you know, like good combat mechanics and stuff like that will really, really help, but I guess I play them for the storyline.
Okay, well, digging just a little bit deeper in this one part, what storylines do you like the most? Or what about the storyline do you need from an RPG?
Over the course, oh man, we're having crappy internet problems. Here, talk real quick so I can see if I can hear you.
I can see and hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. It's probably me, like I said, the internet's being pooey. I mean, thematically, there's not really one thing that I do or don't go for. I do like the storyline to feel mature. I don't like a lot of cliches, which it seems like they're full of, and cliches could be anything. I want something epic. I generally do like saving the world, but in the process of saving the world, let's say, I don't like it when the threat or the you know, the primary antagonist of the story is like clear cut. That's one of the things that I loved about, I guess, just going back to 7 and like many, just for the sake of example, because a lot of people have played it. It's kind of like you first play this game and you're like, oh, the Shinra Corporation. I'm in Midgar. Like for me, I had never played another RPG before, so I'm going through Midgar and like Shinra's there, and we're gonna bring down Shinra. They're, you know, stealing energy and the life source of the planet, and they're polluting everything and whatnot. And then after you go over that one little hump of an arc, you end up on the world map, and you start finding out about like Sephiroth, and like the story's bigger, and the same thing for like Final Fantasy VIII. It's like, oh, the sorceress, and we're going to assassinate her, but it's not really about the sorceress. And same thing with 9. It's like the queen, but it's not really about the queen. And I just love it when they, like any other good piece of fiction, when it twists and turns and the characters feel real and the story feels epic. I think that was one of the things, like for example, I just completed Persona 4, and one of the things that I didn't like about it, even though I kind of fell in love with the characters, was that the storyline just felt like, I don't know, like some stuff's going on the street outside, like it just felt like right in the middle, like too.
Pretty ambivalent material.
Yeah, it felt like high school, and I was like, oh, we're not saving the world, we're figuring out a small town murder, and that just really bothered me. Do you have anything that you look for when you kind of tiptoe in and around JRPGs, or what you find yourself being intrigued by?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was going through that little phase on the Dreamcast where I had that Nintendo emulator, I played through Final Fantasy 1 and 2, and I was on to 3, and I was touching on a couple others. I also, at that time, had just gotten my first DS. It was the original DS.
Nice.
And I picked up Golden Sun 1 and 2, and I was playing through those.
Played the first
which are
one.
a blast.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And that was, between those games, I was hooked. And I had picked up 7, and I had picked up 9. I should say Final Fantasy 7 and 9. They're such iconic games where you can refer to them by their
just the number.
I had picked up Final Fantasy 7 and 9, and I was starting to play through 9, and I was like, I love 9, but 7 I wasn't loving, and this was, of course, I was playing them out of order, and I wasn't with progression.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't as big of a fan of the steampunk style, futuristic style world set. And I put that out. My friends and I have an email thread that we talk with each other pretty constantly about. And I said, hey, does anyone else think that the Final fantasy games are better than the Final Fantasy sci-fi games? And one of my friends who actually now writes for GameSpot was like, you are now considered a hardcore Final Fantasy fan. But I wouldn't want to say that a world set would turn me off unless it's a bad world set.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really prefer a good set of characters and a good story. That's hard enough to find in any art form. The difference is that in a video game, it's so much more tangible because you're playing the characters and you're manipulating those images on screen. And again, I don't want to count out any of them, but I do really like the fantasy epic versus, say, a steampunk epic.
Would you say that in general, like, if you had to choose fantasy or sci-fi, fantasy as in dragons and
sword and sorcery.
Sword and sorcery, there you go. Versus sci-fi / steampunk, do you lean fantasy?
I think generally I do.
Okay.
But I think it also really depends on the type of game. Something like Mass Effect appeals to me as a sci-fi game,
mm-hmm.
and I hate Dragon Age.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah.
But I think those are also very different games. And I think no one would disagree with that.
No, yeah.
And again, it's not to say that I think it's impossible for one to be the other. For instance, I think I only played about 7 hours of Earthbound or something like that, but I thought it was great. It's adorable. It's a lot of fun, and it has all of the good mechanics, or the mechanics that make a good JRPG. The building of the ensemble, powers, leveling up, characters who have abilities and skills and powers that are sort of in line with their traits, that emphasize how you play them in combat, and then how decisions you make as you go along. That's all very beautiful, and it's just about saving your little hometown. It's about a mini alien invasion, or at least it's the first. And so storyline, it's hard to say if there's one that I prefer, but the JRPG really lends itself to an epic save the world, or or at the very least, it would be good if it's just a really convoluted story with a lot of mixed motivations.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe that's the ticket. It's I want a storyline that looks like it's more than, like you were saying, just a high school drama. Mm-hmm. Unless that high school drama happens to be really complicated. If I'm going to be spending $50 to $100 on a game, I want to feel like what's important to the characters is actually important.
Yes.
Maybe that's the key. Maybe it's just the character's connection to the importance of the storyline. I've got to feel a strong connection there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why bother?
Some games take it over the top. Also, for example, not to spoil too much, but for people who have played Star Ocean 3 till the end of time on PlayStation 2, towards the end of that game, they actually start breaking the fourth wall, and I was
really?
like, what? I was really put off by it. I was like, this is interesting, but
like a video game with Deadpool in it.
Yeah, like I said, I don't want to go too spoilery, but there are times where it's almost like they're running out of ideas for a while, and I don't know.
Yeah, it beats me.
Anyways.
All right, so let's hit the last point. menus and statistics and customization. It's a really strange thing. It's not quite like counting headshots or counting bullets fired in, say, Perfect Dark or in various other first-person shooters, or even stuff like Just Cause, where you can count how many people you've killed or how many cars you've stolen. Or Grand Theft Auto, of course, is another good example of that. Or even like in Fable, where you can count how many chickens you've kicked or how many pies you've eaten.
Right.
The menus and customization and statistics in a JRPG relate to how you've played the game.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you? Is that what engrosses you about following the numbers in a JRPG?
Yeah, and some games are better at it than others. Like for example, when I started going through the tutorials for RPG Maker, it was real interesting to see the whole genre kind of broken down in, just basically you move from point A to point B, and from point A to point B you battle, and you get experience, and you level up, and you get stronger. Maybe you get money to buy better weapons and armor, and then you use all of that at the end of point A to fight a boss to be able to move through point B, and you essentially just do that over and over and over again. And so it's games where these systems are incredibly deep and incredibly customizable, where the systems are customizable to the point where there was no clear-cut way for you to defeat boss A. You just did, and you figured it out, and you figured it out by your own means. I think that's why a lot of people like Final Fantasy VII also, is because the materia magic system in that game it's like a work of art in and of itself. Just putting gems in weapon slots to increase magic power, or even carry electricity spells, and the way that those do and don't affect your attack and defense. It's kind of like it's customizing things you're already customizing, and yeah, I don't know. I just love it, but I can see how it's a really big turnoff for a lot of people, and how that's kind of like an entry barrier, and why in the West, like action RPGs, it tend to be more popular, because it's not just looking at numbers and inputting commands, but it's actual, when you start getting into titles like Dragon Age 2 and like some other action RPGs, it's getting that immediate feedback, for how you're choosing to play and stuff like that.
Certainly. And I know as a kid, for me anyway, anything that had too much reading, not that I didn't like reading, but I was playing a video game to be immediately gratified. And so if I had to sit there and do logistics of, I've got this main character who's got this sword, and I have to level up this skill so he's better at this sword at this point, so he can do 10% more damage, and if I put this gem in it, he'll level up here. And if I sync his building of this skill, the quick draw skill, let's say, then he gets X number of percentage more. It's like all this math and all this strategizing just didn't appeal to me as a kid. And honestly, even now, I have difficulty doing it because I don't enjoy thinking like that when I'm by myself.
Oh, interesting.
So it makes it really difficult for me to sit down and play those sorts of games. Also, I tend to get wrapped up in making decisions based on character rather than strategy. So I know there was one time I had invited a friend over, and I showed him my save in Final Fantasy IX. He's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "What? He would wear these boots." And he's like, "But if you wore these, you get this bonus to this." And I was like, "So?" I was like, "I'm making my way through the game just fine." He's like, "Yeah, but you could be killing."
You're like equipping characters with the green tunic from the first town, because you're like, he likes green.
He likes green, and I've leveled up that tunic so many times. It works so well for him. I get really attached to certain items that I spend a lot of time with. I'm trying to remember the specific game where I was having trouble letting go. Oh, you know what? Actually, this is to come up later, but it was Dark Souls.
Oh, okay.
Especially in that game, because you cling to your items in that game.
Yeah.
But yeah, in Dark Souls, I had leveled up this halberd over and over, and then I came across one that I hadn't played with at all, and it was slightly better. I was like, nope, Nope, I'm sticking with my powder that's been with me since basically the beginning of the game. Like, I've put so many experience points and so many gems and all this other crap into it. Yeah, I can handle the +4 instead of the +5. And then, of course, at some point I broke. I was like, nah, I really need it. But it's funny, and just to clarify, the way a lot of JRPGs work is that, aside from just leveling up your character, as you level up, your character has different skills. They could have steal, they could have like quick attack, they could have first strike, they could have all these powers that assist them in combat. Some of them have healing spells, some of them have wizard spells, attack spells, protection spells, and different items will augment those powers. Sometimes you can put a gem on a sword and it gives it fire damage. This is really, really low end sort of
understanding of it.
Yeah, because you can get those sorts of powers in any game, but the way that JRPGs tend to work is that by mixing a lot of these powers and abilities, you get greater effects. And if you level up one in conjunction with another, you can get another effect. And so the reason that menus and customization are so important is because you build this character as you go along. And that's one of the ways, mechanically, that the game endears you to the characters and to the story, is because it feels like you've put all this thought and time into building this person. And even though it's just for combat, these are ways that the character expresses itself narratively.
I've got a question for you, not to derail us from our outline and whatnot. Also, let's say hi to we have a viewer. It says there, one viewer. Somebody might be watching this.
Oh, my.
Hi, viewer!
I can't see anybody.
Oh, really? I see. It says one viewer. Maybe it's you. Anyways, if it's not... No, because it said 0 before. Anyways, you still play a tabletop pen and paper RPGs, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so do you feel, as somebody who knows a lot and plays tabletop RPGs, that, so in tabletop RPGs, like I said, not to derail us too much,
No, it was a good comparison, I'm sure.
Let's say you have a sheet of paper, right, and you've got your character and your class, and you are doing a lot of the same things. You're customizing this character and creating them, and then bringing them through the storyline and combat and whatever else it is that the game is about. Do you feel like Japanese role-playing games, with their menu systems and their intricacies and their turn-based combat in that sense, is more in line with what tabletop RPGs are, or is a game like Skyrim, where it's an action RPG with a lot of numbers running underneath the hood, are more similar to the realization of a pen and paper RPG in video game form?
Concisely, a Japanese role-playing game is much more similar to a pen and paper RPG. However, there has to be one very large caveat, which is to say the Baldur's Gate series was based on second edition D&D rules.
Yeah.
and so if you sat down and played Baldur's Gate, you knew what all of the numbers meant if you had played second ed D&D.
Yeah.
The biggest difference with Baldur's Gate, and I think this was something that you could customize actually, is that it was an action RPG, and so it was real-time combat. But I think there was an option to slow that down to turn-based, which would make it almost identical to tabletop, except of course that your friends weren't sitting around actually rolling dice.
Yeah, I believe you could hit spacebar during that game's combat, or at least there was the option to hit spacebar and time it at any point, and then click on your party members on the map and choose what moves they were going to execute next and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's super cheap on Steam right now, I think, so
nice.
If there's any question, you can go ahead and check it out for a reasonable price.
Yeah, I started playing Baldur's Gate 1, the iOS version, when they released the enhanced iPad version not too long ago, and I was loving it for the most part. But just tapping the walk, it didn't bother me. But like not having a right click and all sorts, you need a mouse and a keyboard for that game. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There are some things that can't replace a mouse and keyboard, and although the controls for a touchpad interfaces are very intuitive, maybe it's just game design that has to change, but yeah, when you're used to mouse and keyboard for certain games, it's really hard to get past it.
Yeah. But, I don't know. Anyways, you want to bring us back on track here?
Yeah, sure. I think we've touched about our fifth subject there, so let's head on to what you've titled Death of the World Map.
So dramatic.
And I think what you're talking about is how back in the day, Final Fantasy used to be top-down, and you would be exploring this really small portion of the world for a while, and you could go in and out of towns, and of course, once you came across the town, it would zoom in onto that town. You'd run on there, you'd leave the town, the world map would bounce back out to a wider view. And then the coolest part of every Final Fantasy game, up until a point, was at a certain point in the game, somebody gave you an airship where they unlocked a bridge.
Freedom!
And suddenly this massive map opened up, and you could go anywhere or do anything, explore all these weird corners of the world, go fight bizarre enemies, find the weird caves or dungeons or abandoned towns, and look for cool items, and just explore on your own. And you could kind of duck in and out of the story as you wanted, but of course, it was always there ready and waiting for you.
Yeah.
Has that gone away? Is that what you mean?
I feel like it largely has, and there's exceptions to the rule. For example, for the most part, the first game to break my heart in that respect would have been Final Fantasy X. Now, I had played linear RPGs prior to Final Fantasy X, like, for example, Legend of Dragoon on the PlayStation 1. You go down a path on the world map, just like literally a linear line, and you follow the storyline and you level up. You explore towns and stuff like that, but there is literally no world map in the game. And so when Final Fantasy X released on the PlayStation 2, I kept waiting to get my airship, and I kept waiting to get the airship. And when I got the airship, I kept waiting for that viewpoint to zoom out and for me to be able to fly around and explore stuff, and it never happened. And all that game ever was choose a destination from this list, click on it, and you appear there. And yeah, you could go back to other areas you had been to previously throughout the journey, and you could explore some new nooks and crannies, and how
does that change the experience then?
Oh man, it makes it feel like less of an adventure. Granted, it's still a story, and it still has the ability to be like a powerful narrative-driven experience when JRPGs are linear, but it takes away from that sense of adventure, that sense of the unknown. Very early on, for example, in Final Fantasy VII, when you leave Midgar, you can stop at this little village, and there's kind of like this mini game where there's like monsters climbing up like a mountain or something like that. I forget. It's kind of like a defense mini game, and you have to periodically come back and do it. And should you accomplish it, you get the Phoenix summon, like cracks from this egg that's left at the top of the mountain, and it's completely optional. And like you said, when you get the airship and you're just flying around the world, and you can go underwater in your submarine, and it's just like you're exploring. There's things that you don't have to do, and you never know when you're running through a little pack of trees, like on the world map, whether or not you're going to run into this one little nook in that forest that's going to open up the game into, like whether you're going to find the hermit's house in the forest, it's like, it's stuff like that.
Yeah, I know for me, whenever I would leave the first village, it was always, this, coming of age moment for my characters. You'd step out, you'd fight your first couple monsters, you're hurting bad, you'd go back to town, which was only like 4 steps away, you'd heal up, you'd go back out, and you play this game of inches, and you'd make your way farther and farther out, and eventually you'd get good enough where you felt confident that you could really spread out and maybe go to the next town or the next couple of towns, and then of course the game would amp up, and then you'd be making those baby steps again. And that's what really gives you the sense of progress in terms of your character's growth, in conjunction, like emotionally in conjunction with the narrative and with the mechanics of the game. And I think it's that union that makes a really good JRPG, which is the mechanics of the game reflect the character's growth, reflect the narrative's growth.
That's a really good way to put it, and I never thought about it. Kind of like the marriage of those two things, and then the sense of accomplishment that you get out of that on multiple levels. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I could see what you mean by when you lose that world map, you lose that connection to the character, and then it becomes a connect the dots experience rather than a choose your own adventure or choose your own path along this adventure quest. And it's just point A to point B or point C, who knows what.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't mind it in Legend of Dragoon because from the very early onset in that game, you like I said, they literally trace a line on the map and you see where you're headed to next. And for Final Fantasy X, that was the first time, possibly ever, but at least that I played a Final Fantasy that didn't have a world map.
And that was a defining characteristic of the Final Fantasy series. It's definitely strange for them to have veered from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always wondered if it was due to technical limitations of like the hardware. Like, for its time, the PS2 was powerful enough. I mean, the Final Fantasy X to this day is still beautiful. It just got remastered for PS3 and Vita and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wondered if they, for the first time ever, the game was fully voice acted, or mostly fully voice acted. And you just had like character models and enemy animations of that level and whatnot. And if they just felt from a design and development standpoint that, pulling out to whatever they were going to have the world look like and be this little character walking through trees, if they just felt like it looked silly,
mm-hmm.
I guess, in relation to everything else they had achieved visually in that game.
I remember when I first was exposed to Final Fantasy VII that I thought it was silly the way that the game changed its aesthetic so dramatically from walking around the town to combat to walking around the world map. But once I finally got into the genre, it just became one part of its characteristic, and it didn't matter to me at all. Similarly, something that has changed is the amount of text in a game. Nintendo's been really stingy about making sure that Link doesn't speak and that you still have to read his speech. He gets some exclamations here or there whenever he gets hit or falls off of something or leaps, but you still haven't heard him speak words. And Final Fantasy certainly has gone from a lot of text to straight-up voice acting. How has that changed the experience for you?
Well, I hope that Link never speaks. I feel like they learned whatever the Metroid game was that was released for the Wii and developed by Team Ninja. I think I want to say Metroid Other M, where for the first time ever there were fully rendered cutscenes of a Samus Aran, and I believe that she was fully voice acted and stuff like that. And I know that it killed the character for a lot of people. Similarly for me, going from games like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, and all the other PS1 era JRPGs and whatnot. When I played 10 and I realized that I was hearing the characters' voices for the first time and stuff like that, it bummed me out because I wasn't able to read what they were saying and kind of fill in those little personality gaps and things like that, like we did in Final Fantasy VII. Like Final Fantasy VII, for example, the localization for it, the translation from the Japanese version is actually not that good. and I don't think that I realized it when I was playing it back in the day, but if you go back now and you read the characters' dialogue, it's pretty poorly written. But despite that, I imagine that you'd be able to play that game nowadays and just read the text and you could fill in those gaps. And I feel like it's almost like a lost art what Nintendo is doing with characters like Link. It's becoming a lost art.
I think that's even specifically why Nintendo doesn't have Link speak, is that they don't want to give him a voice and take away the voice that everyone has come up with in their heads.
Yes.
And I know when I watch a lot of foreign movies that I always prefer subtitles to dubbing, not because the voice changes, although that makes a big difference because the performance, the delivery of the voice is as important as the words itself. But because oftentimes when they translate and dub, they have to make concessions, whereas the subtitles are as good of a translation as they can get.
Mm-hmm.
And it also changes my leeway with the language itself, but in a video game, when it's the text, it makes it feel like a book again, as we've compared it to once before. So you've got this visual that you're interacting with, and then you get to read a piece. And it seems strange to be excited to read during a video game, but it's part of the JRPG experience, if nothing else. But then I do like cutscenes and I do like performances, but my friend once pointed out, he's like, how ridiculous is it that in a video game, for completing a certain part of the game, your reward is to watch a movie.
Well, okay, I got a few things to say on that, but go on.
No, I mean that's pretty much where I'm at. Like, I'm not against cutscenes. They can be very beautiful, and video games have, like, companies like Blizzard have made better cutscenes than Hollywood.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, I don't know if you watch any of the supercuts of a Blizzard video game, they're awesome. They're like short movies that are streets ahead of anything that Hollywood's put out. Watch the supercut for StarCraft 2. It'll blow your mind. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So I'm not against cutscenes, but there is something very endearing, almost personal, about being able to sit there and read the text on the screen. And there is a part of me that doesn't want a video game to turn into a movie, and an elaborate cutscene with full voice acting is a really strong step in that direction.
Yeah. I feel like a couple things that I wanted to say, and that one was jumping from the PlayStation 1 RPG era to PlayStation 2 when things began to be voice acted. Was probably a very similar experience. I'm not a huge reader, but I do enjoy reading from time to time. And like for example, I read Game of Thrones, the first 2 books, and then when I started watching the series on HBO, I actually think that was one example where the translation was really, really great. I was really, really pleased with the casting and the performances and the production value and everything. But I imagine, especially when it comes to Hollywood films that are based on like book adaptations that just get butchered, that fans of the literature who go to watch the movie, like, that's kind of a rough experience, seeing something that you enjoyed thoroughly and had in your head, and the way people looked and the way they sounded, and you just want people, you just want to leave it alone. But I know they can't. But it's kind of like what it was like going from like PS1 to PS2. And then I guess my other thing was that as far as like the cutscenes go, I agree that especially like nowadays with fully voice acted cinematic cutscenes that last forever after you accomplish something in a game, that it can get out of hand. But like back in the day, and maybe this is for StarCraft 2, I'm not sure, but definitely during the PlayStation 1 RPG era, I thought it was so cool completing a boss battle or getting to a point in the game where you could see this world realized from a perspective that you were not able to see in combat, and you weren't exactly able to see while you were just like traversing, towns and stuff like that. And back then, they weren't voice acted, so they were never kind of ruining the things that you were hearing in your head. One of the things that I loved about Final Fantasy VIII in particular was when that PlayStation 1 technology got to the point where, and 7 did it a little bit, where there's cutscenes running in the background, and your characters are actually running through battle scenes in real time. I was like, that was like the ultimate fusion of the technology, in my opinion, kind of like the pinnacle of it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I know I've always enjoyed, and some people really hate it, but I like when you have those real-time events during cutscenes, because that makes it feel like you're actually interacting with the movie or with the polished version of the game. And if we get to the point where you can actually affect more and more of the game during those events, that would be pretty cool. I think it's a good point to differentiate the cutscenes that have full voice acting versus the cutscenes that didn't have any. Like, I'm a huge fan of the Uncharted series. I love those cutscenes.
Oh yeah, because they're fully interactive, right?
Well, not all of them. No. A lot of them are just straight up movies, and I mean it's better than any Indiana Jones movies that I've ever seen. And so it is a reward because they're really good. And
I guess I'm thinking of. Oh, go on. Sorry.
No, it's different if it's just kind of a cutscene to move from one scene to the next. That's not rewarding, but like the writing and the character acting, it's all a lot of fun in Uncharted, and it's part of the game in that respect. But in other cases, when it's just, oh, here's a quick motion from one scene to the next, and that's boring. Why would I watch that?
Yeah, no, I guess for Uncharted, sorry, it was like it just popped into my head, was You're right that there's a big difference between, in the beginning of the game when they're all the cutscenes of them all, standing around getting drinks before they go on like the heist mission and stuff like that. But there's those moments like when you're on the train and stuff like that, and the train's derailing and you're running, and it's like it's all in game, and it feels so cinematic. But you're like, oh my god, I'm still controlling the, it's just
Yeah, I think it's Uncharted 2 where you've got that chase scene at the end of the game where you're hopping between the vehicles in this huge convoy.
Yes,
Killer,
that too. Yeah.
Killer moment. Well, since we've stepped full on into Western gaming, let's talk about the Western influence on RPGs and on JRPGs. I don't know at what point Western RPGs became a thing. I think it's pretty easy to say that Bethesda and the Elder Scrolls series sits sort of at the top as far as influential Western RPGs go. We talked earlier about the open world map for JRPGs. It seems like Western games took that idea and ran with it, and now it's really commonplace for Western RPGs to give you a huge world to run around in that doesn't require you to follow the narrative of the game, and gives you a ton of stuff to do off to the side of that, while still having a really strong through line or narrative backbone.
Mm-hmm.
But how has that affected Japanese role-playing games, or have they sat comfortably next to each other in harmony?
Oh man, I feel like it's a good question. In some ways, okay, for example, I feel like when Japanese developers look at the Western market, this is going to sound cliche, but I believe that they see a market that loves action, not only action, but action. And so in response to that, like, Sega published Valkyria Chronicles, for example. It was just kind of like a maybe Western-themed military RPG hybrid where you have certain turn-based mechanics in place when you're like on the battlefield and stuff like that, but it's still menu-driven, it's still stat-driven. It's like they fuse turn-based stuff with action stuff. Have you ever played Valkyria Chronicles?
I have not.
Yeah, it's like I don't know how to describe it. It's like a war game with this light fantasy elements, and it's two sides pitched against each other. Anyways, really big storyline and whatnot. And you got a bunch of party members, and they all have different classes and different roles in your battle, and they all have an order that they go in. But when you're actually controlling them, you're running around in real time, and as you run around, you have a gauge that goes down that's kind of like, consider it like a stamina bar. And once that gauge goes all the way down, they have to stop moving, and you either have to, like duck into defense or, choose a target. So there's been like some fusions like that, but I feel like as far as pure turn-based Japanese role-playing games, that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't feel like the Western, like things like Skyrim and Mass Effect have had much of an influence on it. Isn't a turn-based Japanese role-playing game always just going to be a turn-based Japanese role-playing game?
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't been able to come up with anything. They seem to be two versions of role-playing games that don't overlap very much. Part of it also has to do with the way a Japanese role-playing game tells its story, or like the trope of the story itself.
Interesting.
Final Fantasy often has a story that is, there is something plaguing the world, and you have to stop it. And oftentimes you end up being the chosen one who has to do it. And in a Western RPG, you're often the chosen one as well. Certainly that's the case in Skyrim, with the Dragonborn and all that. But oftentimes, the world is not at peril because of something that people have upset. There's a really strong theme in a Japanese role-playing game that humans or the people of the world have upset some sort of natural balance. And someone's either taking advantage of that, or the world is in peril because of it. And in a Western game, it's often just like straight up selfishness or the need to control or the quest for power that is at the helm or the forefront of the narrative. And I'm making some really broad strokes here, and I wish I could come up with more specific examples. But I've had a hard time coming up with strong parallels or influences in either direction. It would seem silly that they haven't influenced each other.
I feel like from a gameplay perspective, if anything, Japanese role-playing games just kind of infiltrated nearly everything that is Western game development. I mean, when you look at stuff like Call of Duty nowadays, with like leveling up and prestiging and getting points for kills and stuff like that, like sports games, like the latest NBA, I think it's the 2K series, if that's the one, whatever the main beautiful popular NBA game is now, like all those characters level up and gain experience and stuff like that, and that's all JRPG stuff right there. It's I've often heard it joked around online and on websites like IGN and stuff like that, where people will often say, like, take any genre, any Western genre of game, and add Japanese role-playing elements to it, and the game will immediately be, dare we say, better, more deep, more fun, give you something, like give it a greater sense of progression. However, I don't feel like it goes the other way around necessarily. I don't know what Japanese developers are looking at the Western developers in what they're doing and saying, hey, we should do that. Besides, trying to create more explosions and I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to look more closely at it another time and come back to it. All right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, go ahead. Okay, go on. I was going to say maybe the one difference is, when we say Western, obviously not just thinking of like North America and whatnot, but so while we're talking about games that are not turn-based but are technically RPGs, if you do look at something like Dark Souls, for example, a game that's made by a Japanese developer, but the look of that game is very medieval, dare we say medieval European, I guess, for all intents and purposes, mixed with dark fantasy. And that could very well be a case of a Eastern developer looking at some kind of like a Western game design and stuff like that and being influenced by it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because that's very much a hack and slash game with the Japanese role-playing game leveling system.
Yeah.
Good point. And that is a tremendous game. Man, they did not screw around at all.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't have. I mean, that hasn't. It's not an open world map, and it's not a huge map. It is, in fact, one of the most interestingly concise and twisted maps I've ever played. Dark Souls is so fascinating. It's one of the few games that does a really good job of maintaining that really eerie mystique throughout the game. And I'm not just terrified because any enemy can kill me at any time, but because I really don't know what to expect to find around every corner.
Yeah,
Dark Souls is tremendous.
A masterclass on so many levels.
Yeah. So in that case, what are some of your favorite Japanese role-playing games?
I wrote a list.
Good.
But I just did a top 5 with some runner-ups, and then for the sake of context, just some of the stuff that I played over the years. So in no particular order, if I had to choose my top 5 favorite, and one of these isn't even like a traditional turn-based game, a lot of these are recent. Anyways, Shin Megami Tensei 4 for the 3DS is it's a turn-based Japanese role-playing game. It does that thing where you run around in third person, but when you go into combat, it's first person. It was really the first Japanese role-playing game where combat took place in a first-person perspective that I actually liked. The storyline twists and turns. I actually don't want to talk about the storyline whatsoever in that game because it is so amazing. Chrono Trigger, I currently have it on my DS. I'm playing it again. But yeah, you can get it on your DS, PlayStation 1, which that version kind of sucks because of the load times, or Super Nintendo where it originated. Final Fantasy VII, we said enough about that.
Sure.
Pokemon X and Y.
Very recent.
Yeah, very recent. And then The World Ends With You, which is also on the DS, and that one's more of like an action RPG. Takes place in Tokyo. It's just like throughout like the different districts, and it's got like really awesome music, and it's real hip, and it's kind of like got this dual screen combat thing going on. And the thing that I love about that game, besides kind of like the style and the vibe of it, is it's got one of these arcs where the main character starts off like really kind of closed off from the world, and as the game progresses and you find out what the world ends with you really means by definition, you just end up loving everything about what they did in that journey that they take you on, even though you don't really see it coming. At least you couldn't have seen it coming in the palm of your hands coming off a DS. Anyways, yeah, so those are probably my top 5 right now. Like I said, World Ends With You, not turn-based, everything else is. So some runner-ups, Final Fantasy 9 and 8. I absolutely adore Xenogears, The Legend of Dragoon, Bravely Default, I beat on 3DS, that game's awesome. Chrono Cross, Shadow Hearts Covenant for the PlayStation 2. I've played other Final Fantasy games that weren't on the PlayStation, Suikoden 3, some of the Tales game series on GameCube, Star Ocean 1 and 2, played a little bit of Dragon Quest 8, a little bit of Earthbound. Like you, I played Earthbound on an emulator also, only it was an emulator for the PlayStation Portable. Skies of Arcadia is also amazing. I played Grandia 2 on Dreamcast. So it's like, and that's just scratching the surface. Played so many. How about you? Do you have any favorites?
I don't have nearly as long of a list. I haven't played nearly as many. I think I'll put Final Fantasy 9 at my top, though. That's the only one that I've invested a ton of time into. I hit about 50 hours in that one, and I think you can do it in 40. I'm pretty close to the end. I haven't actually finished it, but I have a problem with that anyway.
Do you remember my Final Fantasy 9 tattoo?
No.
I have a Final Fantasy 9 tattoo on my arm. Yeah, I absolutely I love that game on a very, very personal level, but because I played 7 first, I can't like really put it ahead of it, Anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people are like that too, because 7 changed the genre single-handedly. It upped the graphics, it upped the gameplay and the story elements. It did, like what Nintendo tends to do a lot of times, it does a lot of things differently, better, and thoroughly. And those games are very unique, and if you got into Final Fantasy VII at the time, it's hard to trump that sensation.
Yes.
But I really like Final Fantasy IX. I like the characters. I also like the world set itself. Yeah, I just had a lot of fun with it, and it's one of the few games that has kept my attention for that long.
Mm-hmm.
I only put about 30 hours into Skyrim, and I was bored by 10. 10 hours, that is.
Yeah.
But I also, I really got into that first Final Fantasy game, and I've wanted to find more and more like that, which is why I played 2. I have 1 and 2 on my DS. I'm trying to play through it again, although it's been a really long time since I powered up my DS. But I don't have a huge background with JRPGs, even though I really, really like the genre. Go ahead.
By Final Fantasy 2 on your DS, you mean like Japanese 2 or like that remake of American 4?
I thought it was Japanese 2, because it is titled... That is the Dawn of Souls.
Oh, interesting.
Cartridge.
Oh.
And I thought that was the Japanese 1 and 2 because at the time, this was an interesting transition to hit. All of a sudden, portable gaming had the power of a PlayStation, and so they could put all the old SNES RPGs in full in the palm of your hand. And at a certain point, they realized that the DS was powerful enough to handle pretty much any of the old Final Fantasy games. I don't think they made it to 7, but they did remake 1 through 6 and release them on the DS.
Oh, crazy! I didn't know that they put Final Fantasy VI on there. See, six is one of those
I
games
thought
that
it did.
you're probably right. Um, six for me, I've played about half of the game, and then for some reason, it's one of those RPGs that I just stopped playing, and I don't know why. Because the people who found RPGs during the Super Nintendo Genesis era, tend to cite that as their
Yeah.
favorite Final Fantasy of all time. It had that Final Fantasy VII like mystique about it for them, and I love 2D artwork in the 8 and 16-bit eras and stuff like that. But for some reason, that game is really hard for me to get into, and I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's just a generational thing.
Yeah.
And it depends on where you started.
Yeah, I'm one of those people though that when people are screaming, and I think they're still screaming, for a Final Fantasy VII remake. As much as I think that could be cool, especially if they like enhance the localization of it and whatnot, I would actually rather see 6 brought to life because I think it'd be a way more compelling world. We don't get very many truly like steampunk worlds mixed with magic and stuff like that, and I think it could be incredible to see them go from 16-bit sprites to like today's technology, versus 7 where it's like it already came out at a time when video games were starting to look pretty good, and because it has pre-rendered backgrounds, it still, in some respects, holds up,
Sure. I sort of disagree.
I imagine it'd be doing it a disservice at the same time.
I mean, I don't need Final Fantasy VII to look better than it does currently, but I remember because I bought it for PlayStation 3, intending to play through it, and I was playing through 9. 9's cutscenes still look really good. You can of course see the pixelization and aged over time, but there's something about the art style that's seemingly timeless. Whereas 7, once I was getting into 7 again, it was just hard to keep that suspension of disbelief. I remember back in the day, someone was like, "Oh, on the PlayStation, they have all this graphical power. You can actually see individual hairs on their head." And that's not true. It wasn't individual hairs. It was just like segments of hair that would kind of shake or distort. Whereas in Final Fantasy IX, between 7 and 9, they had developed their graphical capability to actually show wavy hair as opposed to a block of hair that shifts out of sync with the rest of the hair.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, again, those are just graphical things. It's not that big of a deal when it comes to gameplay because the game itself still works and you can still see your way through it.
Yeah. The interesting thing about 7 and 9 in that regard, then, for me, for some reason 7, and I haven't played it in a really, really long time, I felt like especially during combat, with as basic as kind of the polygonal character models were for enemies and stuff like that, where there's still something very crisp about them to this day because they weren't heavily textured and stuff like that. But Final Fantasy IX in particular, from the very first time I started playing it when it launched, when you're in, what's the first town, Alexandria or something, Alexandria, in the beginning of the game, with the way the PlayStation graphics were and how they do that thing where stuff shifts from time to time, I almost could never tell exactly what I was looking at in that game. I'm like, is it a hippo? Is it a frog bear? And it wasn't until I popped that Final Fantasy IX disc into my PlayStation 2 and was able to turn on texture smoothing as one of the options that I was like, oh, it is a hippo,
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it was a funny time. Like 3D graphics were just becoming, or were just coming into their own, and some people were overreaching and also just trying things that hadn't been tried before. There was a lot of experimentation at the time. It was a fantastic time to be into video games because it was exploding and it was doing things that we hadn't seen or experienced before. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Are you? Is there any Japanese role-playing game that you can think of that you're necessarily looking forward to play in the future, whether it be new or, like an older one that you might pick up on a rainy day?
It's funny. I was actually just looking through any potentials on Steam But I still want to play through Final Fantasy VII, which I haven't done yet. I would like to play through Final Fantasy VI. I have been interested in Shin Megami Tensei because it's come up on a lot of best of lists, and I know you're a big fan.
Yeah.
A couple of the ones on Steam were like The Last Remnant, which is made by Squaresoft, supposed to be good. And, well, no, The Longest Journey doesn't count as a JRPG, I don't believe. But I don't have a huge long list. It's mostly Final Fantasy games because I got really endeared to the first couple there.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah. One of them I haven't actually played, but have seen played a little bit. Do you still have an Xbox 360 in your household, or?
Nope. In fact, my roommate's playing it right now.
Yeah, Lost Odyssey for that, which was made by Mistwalker Studios.
That's right. I heard that's amazing.
Yeah, Sakaguchi-san, who did, like the Final Fantasy Godfather, is the one who directed it and everything. I was watching Garrett play it a while ago when it, it first came out-ish or whatever, and it looked incredible. Just the storyline and the characters and just literally everything that you love about JRPGs is in there. Some technical flaws and stuff like that because they didn't really iron out the engine completely, but there is a world map in it, and it's just supposed to be an emotional roller coaster, to the fullest. So I highly recommend that. You have a PlayStation 3. One of the titles that I'm looking at picking up, one of the $10 ones in the PS2 section of the PlayStation Network store, is Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne. Okay. It's like the third entry in the SMT series. Supposedly, when they released it here in the States, they didn't even put the 3 in front of it because, kind of like Final Fantasy, you could just like hop into it. Everything from that game's art style to its storyline is supposed to be amazing. It takes place, I think, shortly after the end of the world, when angels and demons are warring with each other over what's left of the world, basically, and you play as a human who's been resurrected as a demon, and some of your friends in that game are some of the last survivors of humanity, and so it's about how your relationships with them change now that you're a demon, and kind of like, how you're going to shape the world with your new powers as the world is ending, and that's what a lot of those Shin Megami Tensei games are about, which is awesome. They're very morally gray. A lot of them have you making choices, and it's always post-apocalyptic or just on the hinge of the apocalypse. And for $10, I'm going to pick up that game real soon. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, then let's wrap it up a little bit here.
Yeah.
What makes the JRPG an important genre?
Oh man, it's still, well, aside from the fact that, like we were saying earlier, that its concepts of progression, like gameplay progression and scope, and the sense of accomplishment you get for tackling their feats and stuff like that, it's almost like the core mechanics running under the hood of JRPGs have made their way into nearly all modern Western developed games, and I feel like that says something. I feel like that's important. I don't know. You have any ideas?
Well, I agree that they have a huge technical importance to video games. Even though a lot of the JRPGs leveling systems come from the tabletop pen and paper RPGs,
Very true.
It's the JRPG that integrated those into video games, and then the video games that came after them copied that from them. But I think also the JRPG was the next progression in terms of narrative storytelling in video games. Starting with the text-based adventures. You're in a dungeon. You wake up in a dungeon. What do? You type in, are there any doors? Doors, yes, no, or whatever. I don't know what the transition was between the text-based adventures and, say, something like Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star, but it feels like those games were definitely the next big step in digital interactive storytelling, and that's something that can't go underestimated. That would be the first step into allowing video games to become a legitimate and profound art style. And that's one half of the video game world. On top of that, they're also heavy in their mechanics. It's not just something like Gone Home or Dear Esther, where there are these narrative-only games that have virtually no mechanic to go along with it. It's like the Japanese role-playing game didn't want to compromise and say, well, if we're going to tell a story, we better just tell a story. And they also said, well, if we're going to play a game, we're also not going to just play a game. So yeah, it's been a huge influence. I don't quite know where it stands right now, but it's obviously not a dead genre. There are plenty of other games on the way. And they've found, I think, a second life on portable systems, because the Vita and the DS in particular are loaded with them.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's safe to say, though, that their heyday almost has come and gone, and almost like the way people embraced Final Fantasy VII in 1997 is now the equivalent of how people embraced Skyrim when it launched, and that the Japanese role-playing game is something that caters more so to a niche audience versus worldwide appeal, like a Bethesda Elder Scroll game?
Kind of. I would hesitate to ever say that a particular genre is dead. It's been a long time since I've found anything in a fighting game that I've found to be interesting. It's been a long time since I've found a real-time strategy game to be interesting. But that doesn't mean they're dead. StarCraft 2 is a huge game, and there are still plenty of people who enjoy fighting games. Street Fighter, all of its incarnations, Killer Instinct just came out for Xbox One. People seem to like that quite a bit. So I wouldn't ever really want to say that the genre as a whole is dead. And I don't want to say that its heyday is past. It always seems to be like a second wind. There's always something else that somebody can do. Maybe it's in a lull right now. But it's still a powerful genre. In terms of comparing it to something like Skyrim, I don't know. In my own head, I would compare Final Fantasy VII to Morrowind, and Final Fantasy IX to Skyrim, because 9 feels to me like the refinement of 7, and Skyrim to me feels like the refinement of Morrowind, whereas Morrowind is a really glitchy game, and not to say that Final Fantasy VII is glitchy, but in terms of my own personal interest, like the way that the game escalated between 7 and 9, or Morrowind or Skyrim. It seems like Skyrim was a game that everybody expected to be great in the way that everyone expected Final Fantasy IX to be great, whereas Morrowind kind of came out of nowhere, and Final Fantasy VII kind of came out of nowhere.
I can see that. I agree with that. Yeah, I'm really, really hoping that Final Fantasy 15 is kind of like that title that brings the Final Fantasy name back into, just the public perception of greatness in role-playing video games.
And it wasn't even that long ago where one of the guys from Square sort of apologized for what they had done to Final Fantasy over the past decade or so. He said that they let the series get out of control, and that they had started making games for a wider and wider audience, forgetting that it was this niche market that had made them so popular in the first place, and those are the people that they had started to ignore. So I am really curious to see what they do to bring it back to its roots. We often see that that's a huge mistake in terms of artistry, because then you're not making the game that you set out to make. You're making a game or an album or a movie that's set to recapture who you once were, as opposed to who you've become. That often tends to be misguided. My favorite example would be Metallica. There's no reason that Metallica should be trying to make Master of Puppets again, but that they should be making music that reflects who they've become. I have not liked their last 2 albums at all. So I would hate to see Final Fantasy suddenly just lose it while they're trying to regain it. I would rather see the series become something entirely new than try to emulate what they once were.
Yeah, the trailers from last E3 and the E3 before that for 15, it looks like they're they're going to do that. It almost looks like they're bridging Final Fantasy VIII with Kingdom Hearts combat. If that makes sense, kind of like real-time action combat. Truly, we don't know anything about the game. We don't know anything about like the systems controlling. We don't know anything about the numbers and the menus and the armor and the spells and stuff like that. Other than the action looks pretty fantastic right now. Like you were saying with Square Enix's apology and whatnot. With Bravely Default on the 3DS, which is essentially, I'm one of those people who agrees that you could say that it's the best Final Fantasy game that they've released in years upon years. That's essentially what it is. It's like a Final Fantasy game that never was, much in the vein of, say, Final Fantasy 2/4 in the U.S. And they saw that in their sales numbers and whatnot, that there's a hungry audience for. Just like ready to eat up turn-based experiences and stuff like that, and that they will pay money for it. And I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah. I mean, there's even an entire game that they've made or program to make and remake Final Fantasy games. RPG Maker is basically make your own Final Fantasy.
Yeah, essentially.
It has a whole lot of mods, and you can end up making it very elaborate, change the worlds and whatnot. But I'm pretty certain that RPG Maker started as a, hey, you really like Final Fantasy? Make your own.
Yeah.
Which is something I'm really excited to get into. But, yeah. JRPGs, what makes a good one?
Okay, so for me, and I'm just going to go super simple on this, like I said, ensemble cast of dynamic characters, a huge world to explore, with the world map, just a big sense of adventure. I need beautiful towns and shopkeepers and mystery and excitement and adventure, but I need it to open up in a really, just more grand scape outside of those towns. And I do. I want to save the world, but I don't want to know how I'm going to do that. I need multiple layers of antagonists. I need to be able to relate on a certain level, and I need to be swept off my feet into a fantastical realm, all at the same time. To me, you combine all those things, and you've got the perfect JRPG. How about you? Any ideas?
Well, all that sounds good. I would say similarly. I want an ensemble cast, turn-based combat.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I forgot to add that.
I want character motivations and characteristics to be linked not just with the game mechanics, but with the unfolding of the narrative. And yeah, I want a strong sense of adventure and exploration, and I want options along the way to explore and further the story on my own terms. And that last part often isn't the case. And it's something that Western RPGs have taken and tried to run with, where you get to be good or bad and do whatever you want in a game. And it's led to some pretty disastrous results, if you ask me. Yeah. There are just dialogue trees that make it feel like you're actually advancing the story or you're playing the character. And any option I have to do that, even if it's an illusion of free will, it helps engage me in the story. And so it's pretty simple sounding, but it gets really detailed and really technical really fast.
I got a quick question for you,
Sure.
Because this is going a lot longer than we always intend. In your JRPGs, do you like being able to customize your character? Like, do you want it to be you in that party with this cast of characters, or do you like just being told a story about these characters whom you are not a part of? Because I think I prefer the latter. I think I preferred playing as a Cloud or a Squall versus having Matt, hanging out with Barrett and Ares.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think I prefer to have the character handed to me in this case, especially because we've seen in games like Skyrim where you can make your character, you can customize them to be whatever you want, you can play the bad guy, or perhaps a better example, Fable, where you play the game however you want and it doesn't end up meaning anything. So I would almost rather play the character that the game wants me to play and experience the narrative as the game development team wanted me to experience it. It's like being told a story and you get to tell them when to turn the page. And that, for me, makes a stronger narrative rather than a game trying to let you do whatever you want and then not end up doing anything.
Very cool. Yeah.
Cool. Any final thoughts?
Oh man, final thought. Nah, we kind of touched base. We touched base on everything. What makes it good? How do we like to play it? Like I said, I could blab on and on about it in one way or another forever. How about you? Final thoughts?
No, I think I'm good.
All right, then. Here's where we're gonna end. That viewer is nowhere. At some point, I derailed this too many times. Anyways, so for 30andnerdy.com, this has been a Japanese role-playing game conversation podcast. I am Matt Sternad, Twitter handle @30andnerdy, and I had the pleasure of discussing this topic with...
I'm Scott William Hannon, @SWHannon, Twitter handle.
And so, yeah, let us know on the Google Plus page, on YouTube, which is like youtube.com/30andnerdy, on 30andnerdy.com. Anywhere there's comments or room to further discuss this, like what are your favorite RPGs? What do and don't you like about the Japanese role-playing game genre? I don't know, just anything we talked about, feel free to flesh out, and we'll hop on there and we'll try to keep the conversation going. Sound good?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
All right, awesome. Then, yeah, thanks for hanging out, Scott.
Absolutely. Take care, man.
Take care.